Bill is not really known primarily as a distinguished history professor at OSU since 1971. How many years that is? 71?
71.
Yeah. So what Bill's primarily known for is being an ultra runner, of course, in our view. He's done 15 ultras, including 6 times McDonald Forest 50K. He held the 70-year-old course record for quite a while until it was rudely taken away from him by our friend Ed Eagleman. And his last back was when he was age 74. And I think that was last year, is that right, Bill? But of course, what Bill really wants to be known as is as a logger. I don't know if that's the best choice for this crowd, but he was a choke setter for his first 2 summers in Oregon, working on clear cuts, I assume. And then during grad school, he worked for 3 years as a foreman on a logging crew. Fire crew, sorry, fire crew. I should read my notes too. But Bill's really a prolific writer. And it's interesting in his writing, he's written many books, over 10 books now, I think, as by my count. And he seems to be getting more and more locally focused in his writing. He started out writing, thinking large, really, about books with topics like the U.S. lumbering industry, or a history of national, state, and private forestry, minor topic. And my favorite is really the capitalist transformation of the American West. I think that was probably from years in Eugene. Anyway, so he started to look closer to home with some later books. He talked about the Great Northwest, the Oregon Story, and Oregon, a Storied Land. All these books. You get the idea. He's getting more and more local as he progresses in his writing. And so the book he's working on now is really a history of T.J. Starker. He's lately written a book about the history of OSU and the history of Benton County. So really focusing on local. I think really his next book after the book about TJ is going to be a book about Clem's Memorial Bench on top of Dimple Hill. that was dedicated when Clem was still a young man, so you know how long ago that was. But today you're really going to hear about OSU's research forest, about McDonald Forest and Peavy Arboretum. He's going to talk a little bit about T.J. Starker and George Peavy buying lands which were funded by the beautiful Mary McDonald, right, in history. It was about over 100 years ago. But I've always wondered, that's Bill's talk. I'm not going to steal his thunder, but we all really wonder where does Bill get his energy? Because he's just an endless fountain of energy all the time, ever since I've known him for these 20 years. And so I found this interview of T.J. Starker in the OSU Oral Archives. And it's online, maybe Bill is laughing, he probably knows the story. So the interviewer, this was done in 1979, and the interviewer asks, where do you get your energy from, TJ? And TJ says, I eat a lot of candy. And the interviewer says, well, candy does it, right? And TJ says, well, it's pretty near the top of every meal. I'll top it off with a piece of candy. My girlfriends give me candy, and I buy candy myself. And the interviewer says, you have girlfriends? And TJ says, oh yes, there's 3 or 4. I swap around and play the field. I've got some nice ones like Peggy Allworth and Mrs. Hanson. Well, I better not name them, right? So, but of course, I'm not suggesting that Bill has girlfriends. I'm just saying he does have a ton of energy. And so please join me in welcoming distinguished Professor Bill Robbins to give us a talk about McDonald Forest and Peavy Arboretum. Not too big for you.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you all for coming. This is a topic that was spurred by conversations with my dear friend, Gabrielle Rosales. So you have contradictions to what I say. I'm sure. I want to thank several people. Lyndon Hilton, who is here, former graduate student, for his excellent master's thesis on Peavy Arboretum, a landscape history from year 0 to 1998 when his thesis was finished. Thanks a lot. Is Larry Landis here? Well, thanks to Larry, he's not here, for providing me with the expertise to get photos that I need. Lena De Gregorio is here. for answering minor questions that I can't figure out that are mostly technical. So thank you, Lena. Mark Bomaso is not here. He's in Hawaii as we speak. And Mark is always very helpful, especially with my biography of T.J. Starker. He's an endless amount of information in that respect and has been very helpful. McDonald Forest in 2025, a beloved place in the Willamette Valley for hikers, small children, dogs, salamanders, slugs, birders, mountain bikers, and runners.
Way back.
That's Mark Bomasil and I approaching Dimple Hill in the Mac Forest run of 2005, so 20 years ago. People who regularly frequent the forest prefer, I think, to see the forest as a changeless landscape. It's never been a changeless landscape, and it never will be. So what I call McDonald Forest's deep history is sometimes shrouded in misinformation. In the past, I have been part of that misinformation myself in my understanding of the forest. So where to begin? How about the Missoula floods of 15,000, 13,000 years ago? The Missoula floods backed up the Willamette Valley to about 400 feet. And when I was out at Peavy Arboretum about 3 weeks ago, I had my sea level monitor on, and I walked up to where it said 400 feet, and that was just where the two roads that go past the lodge, and one goes around Randall Pond, and where they join. That's where 400 feet is. So that's pretty dramatic. Archaeological finds about humans in the Willamette Valley date from about 11,500 years ago. Now for McDonald Forest, Peavy Arboretum proper, the archaeological findings, the earliest evidence is about 5,000 years ago, thanks to Lyndon Hilton. He excavated subterraneous camas ovens there on the Kalapuya Creek area several years ago. That's one place. There were also obsidian tools that were found in the Peavy Arboretum area. Obsidian tools come from the obsidian cliffs, which are way up the Mackenzie River. And that's a source of dramatic distribution of obsidian, and it shows the extensive trading networks that indigenous people had. It's impressive as all get out. The small Kalapuya bands in the Willamette Valley inhabited feeder streams into the valley on both sides, the west side and the east side of the valley. And people subsisted on camas, other root bulbs and so forth, and also animals that they used burning practices to kill animals. Now that was a relatively stable lifeway for about 10,000 years, with some differences in cooler periods and warmer periods, but for about 10,000 years that was fairly stable lifeway. But it was destroyed when malaria epidemics spread among the Kalapuya seasonally from 1830 to 1833. 4-year period, 90% of the Kalapuya died. Dramatic testimony to the effect of exogenous diseases that affected the people who had no biological immunity. And I want to read to you a passage from Robert Boyd, who is the expert on this, Bob Boyd, about the recurring malaria epidemics. They were devastating to Indians along the lower Columbia, in the Willamette Valley, and in villages on Oregon's coastal estuaries. In a letter to Hudson's Bay Company officials in October 1830, John McLaughlin estimated that native death toll at 75% in the vicinity of Fort Vancouver. Botanist David Douglas recorded a similar description that same month, and I quote, "A dreadfully fatal intermittent fever broke out in the lower parts of this river about 11 weeks ago, which has depopulated the country. End of quotation. By the time the epidemic had run its course, about 90%, 14,000 people who lived on the lower Columbia and the Willamette River had died. When Lieutenant Charles Wilkes of U.S. Exploring Expedition visited the region in 1841, he counted 575 Chinook survivors on the Columbia and 600 Kalapuyans in the Willamette Valley. Devastating testimony to the ravages of disease. Somebody asked me yesterday if smallpox had appeared earlier, and it had, but this is the most copiously documented evidence of a disease in the Pacific Northwest, I would say, because of the number of human observations of the extent of the disease. The Willamette Valley was a fire-created landscape. The Kalapuya, indigenous people elsewhere across the continent, burned for functional purposes, for food gathering and for capturing game. And I had access to federal surveyors' notes in the mid-1850s. They went through the Willamette Valley and elsewhere. And they're interesting observations, and I'm going to quote just unique passages. Oak openings. This is in the Peavy Arboretum area of McDonald Forest. Oak openings, oak timber, prairie. Most is prairie and the rest hilly and timbered with oak. End of quotation. Survey records for the high ridges in McDonald Forest reveal a different landscape. Rough and mountainous, fir timber with undergrowth of vine maple, hazel, alder, cherry, and briars. And then I have three, these are from Lyndon's master's thesis, three people who observed the changes in the landscape. First is Ed Williams, whose parents arrived in 1852, and I quote, "The foothill plains were more attractive than now." This is when he's an older man. Timber on the hills was scattering oak trees and a heavy growth of grass over the hills and valleys. Edward Blake, who grew up then Peavy Arboretum, recalls as a youth traveling nearly 1.5 miles for firewood. Get that one. Tree rings in stumps in McDonald Forest revealed regular burning until about 1850, marking the arrival of large numbers of Euro-Americans. Now think of that in terms of the growth of Douglas fir in McDonald Forest in age categories. What happened after 1840 is the imposition of new cultural and political practices in the Willamette Valley. The United States took exclusive possession of the Northwest in 1848 in a treaty with England, and the U.S. in 1855 dictated a treaty with the surviving Kalapuya that included the entire Willamette Valley. And you can see on the screen the dotted line. And it always strikes me as, in defense of a treaty, you know, these are surviving members of the Kalapuya that I mentioned yesterday, devastated by the malaria epidemics. Those new values imposed on the landscape also included private property. And the best representation of that was a measure passed by Congress in 1850, the Donation Land Act. And the Donation Land Act applied primarily to the Willamette Valley, the Umpqua Valley, and then the Rogue River Valley. That's where, I don't know what the total number of claims, but most of them were in those three river valleys. And sort of in successive order, the Willamette Valley being first because of the occupation by white incomers, and then the Umpqua and the Rogue River Valley later. The donation land claims were incredibly generous. 640 acres, a full section, to a man, and a white man and a woman that he was married. The donation claims embrace most of McDonald Forest. And I don't have all the names of land claims. I could do that, but it would be an extensive search. But you can trace the ownerships of successive owners through those original donation land records, through deeds in county courthouse, if you want to go through a dizzying array of information. Now, with the coming of this new cultural prescription for the landscape, Indian fires end, the valley landscape began to change, and brush began to grow down the hillsides. And I remember when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, reading an item in the Oregon Statesman, something to that effect, in the 1860s about brush growing down into the valley bottoms itself. This is a modern photo of Douglas fir and other species you can see that have colonized part of the lower valley area. Before Peavy Arboretum was established in 1925, there was a railroad tie sawmill that operated on Callaway Creek. I don't have the exact date, but it was about 1916. And the ties were sold to the Southern Pacific Railroad Company. And the tie mill didn't last that long. There were other mills in McDonald Forest today, somewhere on the Oak Creek drainage and so forth. A brief history of McDonald Forest in 1922, this is before the purchase of the land, describes the Arboretum. Open to fairly dense stands of Douglas fir of various age classes, intermingled with grassy flats and openings, with some 10 to 15-year-old cutover areas, all in private ownership. And what's interesting here is the dynamics of landscapes. Landscapes are changing. In 1900, the foothills of the Willamette Valley were beginning to fill downslope with Douglas fir. And I'm going to quote from Lyndon Hilton's master's thesis. The landscape experienced a rapid, culturally induced ecological transformation in the space of a half century, 1850, let's say, to 1900. And a wonderful passage by Chris Anderson, who taught in the OSU English department for years, and Chris and his wife have a home on the edge of McDonald Forest. His house is on a donation land claim, as Chris wrote in a beautiful essay about the Arboretum area. He wrote, "We live on the upper pasture of Price Fuller," the donation land claim. Establishing the Arboretum. Before the School of Forestry acquired any land, the Arboretum was the first place, away from campus, faculty members took their students across Mary's River to Avery's Wood, where there were cows pastured there was some Douglas fir and so forth. And T.J. Starker was one of those people. This is a photograph of T.J. Starker when he was a student in 1910 at Oregon Agricultural College. I love this photograph. I discovered it on the front page of the Gazette Times sometime in the 1970s when I was teaching Pacific Northwest history. And then I got to know more by talking to people in the community. You know, he's the tallest guy. He's standing probably on a rock or something, looming over everybody else. And then he becomes this very prominent figure in the history of Benton County. George Peavy became Dean of the School of Forestry in 1910. And George Peavy took forestry students for the first first trip away from campus. This is taken down on the Columbia River near St. Helens in 1910. Anyway, George Peavy worked with Starker, who joined the faculty in 1922 after he earned his master's degree at Michigan, University of Michigan, and Sinclair Wilson, who was an important colleague of Starker's as a student, and then later as a forester working for the Pacific Northwest Pacific Northwest Research Station. So the three of them begin to collaborate to raise money from the faculty, friends of the forestry school and so forth, and they raise enough money to purchase property. And I found a passage in 1924 from the forestry students' publication. It was called the Annual Cruise. It called for a forest arboretum, an outdoor laboratory, I'm quoting that word laboratory, an outdoor laboratory in which experiments with various species could be conducted. Anyway, they raised the money and students and funded the purchase of 340 acres, about 7 miles north of Corvallis. 80 acres of that to be set aside as an arboretum. Starker had his students go out and survey the arboretum. We also did other work about potential plots of planting seedlings and so forth. And it was Sinclair Wilson's idea, actually, suggested to Starker that they dedicate the arboretum to George Peavy. And Starker went about making the arrangements for the dedication. And it's an interesting, in a letter to Starker, Wilson refers to Peavy as the inspirer of the movement, which I thought was a nice phrase. The dedication was held in the Arboretum on January 23rd, 1926. It didn't rain. Notice the landscape. It's clear. The original cabin that you see in the photo was destroyed by fire in 1949, and the present cabin is built on the same footprint, which makes it interesting. But no rain. And Lena reminded me of the juxtaposition of this photo with a photo that might be taken today. They're all males in the photo. Thank you. But this is a next photo, photo 15. This is a dynamic landscape. No, go back one. Yeah, that's a photo I took a couple of weeks ago. A dynamic landscape. Differences over 90 some years of time. For T.J. Starker, the Arboretum would be what he called his silvicultural laboratory. And I don't have the observations of other forestry professors at the time, but it would be very similar. He cited his silvicultural research, students doing the work, counting growth rings on trees, soil types, and natural regeneration. In other words, seed trees distributing by wind and so forth. Regeneration, which was a popular thesis at that time until they decided it didn't work very well, especially when they began, loggers began cutting larger landscapes. Becoming McDonald Forest, Mary McDonald, a wealthy widow from California, provided major funding for lots of other activities at Oregon Agricultural College / Oregon State University. She provided 2 scholarships for students in the 1920s. She gave the School of Forestry a full section, 640 acres of land in Jackson County in 1926, and I'm not sure about that, but I think the university still owns that area. But don't place any bets on what I'm saying. Her major gift to the university, to the School of Forestry, and her work were to acquire garden land in the vicinity of the college for use in experimental planting and reforestation. George Peavy, dean of the school until 1932, became president of Oregon State College in 1932, served until 1940. He held the funds, and he hired designated a faculty member to to identify and negotiate how they could piece together a landscape. And that person, this surprised the heck out of me, was T.J. Starker. He was the field agent that went out and identified. And this took place between 1929 for Starker and 1938. And I have a page here from a book about the individual purchases, the time, the section numbers that made up McDonald Forest, section 25, section 35, and section 36 mostly. There were some others involved as well. But it's interesting that his Starker's effort to piece together from multiple landowners during the 1930s. And there's another caveat here. You should remember that the 1930s, of course, was in the midst of the Great Depression, when people in the landscape of McDonald Forest, if you own someplace like where Baker Creek runs through, I can dump that, get money for it, you do it. So that was the context in which the exchanges were made. Thornton Munger, I just skipped over that. That's all, you're doing fine, Ken. Don't worry. I meant to say that Thornton Munger was the designated speaker at the dedication, and I skipped over that part. It was a beautiful dedication, and I'll come back to Thornton Munger's speech at the end of this presentation. But Mary McDonald, very significant person, and she also donated books, expensively bound books, to the library, and hence they have the McDonald Room in the library. That's the bequest of Mary McDonald. When she died in 1935, the forest had already included about 3,000 acres, and it was to grow. The other part of McDonald Forest, McDonald Dun, came after the Second World War, and that had to do with a negotiation that Dean of the College of School of Forestry, Paul Dunn, worked out with the War Assets Administration to transfer 6,200 acres from the War Assets Administration. It was part of Paul Dunn with the opposition of the President A.J. Strand at the time, but Dunn was more persuasive. There were restrictions on the 6,200 acres, and this would involve the schools of agriculture and forestry. They were to use the lands as teaching laboratories, which I found interesting. There's that word laboratories again. They were to submit annual reports to the Department of the Army, and the land could not be sold for 25 years. And then there was an additional caveat. They had to make public notice. They were required to make public notice about, and I quote, explosive contamination of the property, because it was a WW2, a military base. The Arboretum. The Oregon State Board of Forestry designated the Arboretum in 1925 as its designated Clark McNary Nursery. Now, the Clark McNary Nursery Act, 1924, passed by Congress, was to provide funds to states to establish nurseries to grow trees. The McNary name, Senator Charles McNary from Oregon. This is one of the first pieces of national legislation that affects forest-related issues from Florida to Washington, state of Washington. To make way for the nursery in Peavy Arboretum, they cut Douglas fir and oak, blocks were removed, stumps were dynamited, and then the land harrowed and made way for planting seedlings. And the initial landscape involved about 5 acres. And this was the state's nursery, keep in mind, until 1946. And if you've been out in the intensive management part on those trails, you see old pipes in the ground, sticking up out of the ground. And that's part of that activity. During the Great Depression, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the famous CCC, had 3 different camps that established themselves in the Peavy Arboretum area. They worked elsewhere too, not just in Peavy Arboretum. They worked on Mary's Peak and other places. But the CCC built the road, the Patterson Road, that goes from Oak Creek to Peavy Arboretum. And I assume that the CCC put that road in after the land was purchased, because otherwise they wouldn't be authorized to do that. And there are old pipes, I might add, that also CCC built Crow Miller Lake. It was a swamp area, a natural swamp area where cattle used to get stuck in the mud. And that's where the CCC cleared it out, put a dam in, and built that made today's Crow Miller Lake. And it's interesting to note, if you look where the water flows out, there's some old piping there that had to do with going down to the where the nursery was. The CCC also built the buildings out at what we call the Fish Lab at the end of Oak Creek, where you head up into McDonald Forest. And there's rock walls there. I'm always impressed with the rock walls that the CCC built. They're incredible. And those rock walls are still there. Okay. Research. Oregon Agricultural College, Oregon State College, and Oregon State University always were involved in research in the forest. Starker was the first to initiate experiments in studying the influence of duff, D-U-F-F, in nurturing trees on the forest floor. He had his students do thinning experiments, pruning experiments, and so forth and so on. In 1927-28, he established the Post Farm. If you've been out there, you've seen the Post Farm. And I took a photo of it a couple of weeks ago when I was out there. So it's still, the landscape still looks the damn same as it did in 1927-28. What he did was he had, students were doing all the work. I should say it was free labor. And they would put the posts in the ground, different species, different shapes of wood and so forth to see how long it would take them to rot. And then treatments and posts that would last longer and so forth. The fascinating thing, they had annual reports that Starker did until he left the university in left the college in 1942. And other people have continued it to the present day. And I understand now that some of the major either telephone or electric companies pay to have posts done there. It's a very different operation. It's not the traditional operation that Starker was doing for farmers who needed fence posts that would stay durable in the ground for much longer. But a very interesting project. The School of Forestry didn't have a special category in its annual reports for research until 1955-56, and then they had a category for research. Now, they had been doing research, of course, since 1925, but not recognizing it as a separate category until much later. By 1975-76, the College of Forestry's annual reports listed 18 research projects, and that balloons, of course, after the mid-1970s. And then the part that probably interests me most about this, and maybe you, recreation and the forest-urban interface. That is a relatively recent phenomenon, probably beginning in about 1990. After 1990, McDonald Dun became increasingly important to surrounding communities, people visiting, greater numbers of people frequenting the forest. I began running in McDonald Forest in the early 1980s, first from Oak Creek, and then later when my daughter was running cross country with Joe Fulton and the Willamette team at Peavy Arboretum, where they would meet every other week or so to run. And as visitors increased, management practices in the forest come under increasing criticism. And I bumped into a fellow a couple of days ago, Phil Hayes, who has written a lot about the Benton County Park System, he knew a lot about Starker too. Starker was on the Parks Commission from its creation, and he was one of the founders in 1957 until he resigned from the commission, upset by all the bureaucratic work that had to be done in 1974. And then the county commissioners wanted him to come back. But in 1974, he was 84 years old, and he pleasantly retired from participating in the Parks Board. But anyway, Phil told me that he urged people, faculty in the College of Forestry, who were very opposed to doing anything to upgrade the forest because it would attract more people. And he finally convinced them to build, a dance trail sometime in the early 1990s. The best study that I found about visitors to the forest, management practices and so forth, revealing, was a 1996 master's thesis by Richard Balfour. It was detailed on McDonald Forest, and what he learned surprised the heck out of me. Negative reactions to clear cuts contributed to increased visits in the forest. So be careful. You want to not have more people in the forest. And he emphasized this in his master's thesis. People who regularly visited the forest, he said, were more inclined to be critical of management practices than those who were just casual visitors. And I don't have the exact year, but Balfour found an sharp increase in recreational use of the forest and an uptick in public concern about forest management after the big clear cut. Balfour's survey revealed, and I'm quoting, Peavy users were very active. Most of them very recent arrivals in Corvallis, less than 5 years. And I think that must have been after Hewlett Packard came to town. Sorry, guys.
It's true.
Another characteristic of the visitors, and I'm quoting again from Balfour's thesis, membership in conservation organizations was quite high. Such people place greater importance on non-community values in the forest. And again, he says, most significant in his master's thesis, visitor counts went up by 48% the summer following a clear-cut harvest. I wish I had the date for that, but I don't. Some visitor numbers to the forest. 1990, 37,000. 1991, 52,000. Since COVID, over 200,000. It gradually improved in COVID, it spiked. It went up after the forest opened up again. Balfour concluded, publicity involving harvest controversies increased public awareness. I want to turn now to a case study, one that fascinated me because I've learned about it, the Cameron Tract. Cameron Tract is a bequest from Elizabeth Starker Cameron to the State Board of Higher Education in 1995 when Elizabeth passed away. It bequested 260 acres along Soap Creek Road Valley to the State Board of Higher Education. The College of Forestry was to manage the property. Now there were other caveats in the bequest. It had to fund the Starker Chair in Private and Family Forestry, and it had to provide $1 million to help the expansion of the OSU library. And so with that bequest and that requirement, OSU Research Forests was obligated to carry out the bequest. That was the donor's intent, in other words. And the College of Forestry, faced with managing the property, announced plans to harvest 84 acres in the summer of 1995. to provide the $1 million to the library's expansion. The news, in the newspaper, an OSU professor living somewhere along Soap Creek Road said the harvest would lower property values, would cause soil erosion, it would topple trees, and it would lower water in levels in wells. Another resident wrote to the Corvallis Gazette Times that they feared flooding of their property during the springtime. And another went after Dean George Brown. He should be called the Dean of Deforestation. And another, I have another quote. Our concerns for the inevitable decrease in property values. And then what I did, using newspapers.com, I did a word search in the Corvallis Gazette Times. The Cameron Tract doesn't appear again until 2006, and that's the 100th anniversary of the College of Forestry. Into the 21st century. OSU Research Forests has been involved for many years, especially in the age of climate change, and I have in my notes into the 21st century and climate change on steroids. The research forest increasingly has involved with carbon sequestration, carbon capture, and strategies to deal with greenhouse gas emissions. And early on, I discovered three publications that specifically focus on climate change and forestry, and there's probably a lot more. The College of Forestry began offering a graduate certificate in forests and climate change several years ago. And this coordinates with global research projects which indicate that reforestation offers the most potential low-cost, effective way to contend against climate abatement. In other words, climate abatement tragedy. The summer of 1920, we're in the 21st century, the summer of 2024, Research Forests scheduled 20 harvests, ranging from 6.2 acres to 64 acres. Of those, the woodpecker harvest was the largest, and only the woodpecker, which was the project took place near Crone Miller Lake, attracted a host of attraction. The woodpecker harvest involved thinning trees to extend the length of harvest rotations, to retain legacy trees, in other words, older trees in the forest, and to influence forest conditions into the future. Directly related to climate change, the woodpecker harvest was to reduce competition for water on southerly slopes. In other words, fewer trees and into the future will survive better. Another objective was to increase diversity of age groups. I don't know if that would apply today. Increase diversity. But to increase the diversity of species and age groups to allow more light in the understory. And if there's more light in the understory, it begins to nurture younger trees, multi-age stance, in other words, of forest. Now, my point is that historically, woodpecker and research projects in OSU forests have extended from 1926 to the present day, and they have always involved teaching and research opportunities, and to demonstrate examples of forest stewardship. That's the ideal. Mistakes occur. Proper stewardship is sometimes elusive, but that has been the guiding principle. There was a storm over the woodpecker harvest, as many of you know. I visited the area in January, and as I've said to many people, it looked just as I expected it would, a responsible ecosystem selectively harvested. And I went out in January and I took 3 photos. Ken, if you could put the first one up. That's a part of the woodpecker harvest. The second one, a little more, that's a different view. And in fact, I could have walked up in there, I could have forgotten what I stuck to the trails. And then the third one, 2 large trees.
A legacy tree.
And I think in balance, these projects are what they do is self-sustaining, because timber harvests in the forests fund all that happens in McDonald Forest. And research forests are managed forests. They're what people out in the beyond the public and private lands call working forests, where trees are planted, cut, harvested. In research forests, they're studying different types of forest management practices. And that's been true since the 1920s and 1930s. McDonald Dunn's mission has never, ever been to create an old growth forest. Now there are within the forest examples of old growth, and those will be there. They've always managed the forest, I think, for what I've been talking about here for several minutes this morning. And I would say that forest management is not error-free. It's science. Science is never error-free. Experimental mistakes in science happen, as Anthony Fauci, my favorite scientist ever, preaches. But those errors lead to scientific advances. And we witnessed that, I think, in the early parts of COVID. That was very clear. Another cardinal point about research forests is that public taxes do not support what happens in the forest, because the harvested timber and so forth is sold and supports those activities. And it is not greed, as some have charged. And I'm going back now to Thornton Lumber, whose dedication address at Peavy Arboretum, January 23rd, 1926. For a research forester, he said, the woods are his laboratory, where he can watch the subtle processes of nature change soil and sunshine into wood, and the trees go through their complex life cycle from seeds to giants. The Arboretum, Munger concluded, would be a classroom with living models, a research laboratory. It will be a mecca for students, a paradise for the lover of trees. Thank you.